Congratulations, Ken. Was it a surprise to you on Wednesday?
I would say shock would be more accurate, Shani. I didn't pay attention to the dates and but when Lanny's voice was on the other end, I've heard that before, and I knew what it was when I heard his voice, but I hadn't paid attention to the timeline, and it came on pretty quick. So I was really proud and really honored. But Lanny's voice is that voice that when it's coming, something good is going to happen.
Just curious, you've had 5 days to reflect and 5 days to think about people that made a difference for you. When I ask you who you thought of first, who would come to mind?
Obviously, my dad. And I'm one of those guys, John, that doesn't spend much in the past. I've never liked reflecting on it and always tried to move forward. So this has really helped me pause and start to think about the people that helped me get here. But my dad, first and foremost, he was a huge influence. And then it was the cast of characters from the university: Claire Drake, George Kingston, Dave King, Tom Watt. Those guys donated their summers every year to help us understand what it was like to be a coach and the responsibility you had. So I really started to hone in on particular people before I became a professional coach that helped me along the way.
Ken, the expression sort of what it's like to be alive for your own funeral. And in a parallel universe a little bit, when you get entered into the Hockey Hall of Fame or any kind of great honor like that, you get overwhelmed in many ways by all the congratulations. You see people writing all these things about you. What's that process been like to just sort of be for this little stretch, almost like the center of your own universe?
You know what, Richard? The part that there's been a ton of terrific responses by people, but the one that really hit home for me was all the ex-players. That really makes it feel like it was worthwhile, and makes it feel that makes me really proud that guys would, take time to find my phone number. And it goes back from when I was in Kalamazoo to when I was in Kamloops to obviously in the NHL. But those texts or phone calls, they mean the world to me, because in my mind, it means you did okay and you did right by them. And I'm really proud of some of the texts and emails that I've got from ex-players.
I told the story last Thursday on the show, Ken. The first time I have had any recollection of you was in Edmonton. I didn't grow up there, but I was there a lot with the Oilers, and I would look up at practice and see this guy in the second deck at the old Coliseum making drills, watching the Oilers skate and designing drills. Did you have this passion to be a coach from the time you couldn't play the game?
Yes. I had it because of my dad. My dad was a coach. He coached minor hockey, and I followed him around when he was coaching midget. And there was an age group called juvenile, which was between midget and junior. So I followed him around, but my passion really started to come into fold when I started attending Claire Drake's practices. And then I snuck into the Coliseum and watched Glenn's practices, and they were eerily similar. And I really thought that this is the way you need to play the game. This is the right way to play the game. And the execution by both teams was exceptional. And the flow and everything, it really sold me on this. If I'm running a hockey team, these are the type of practices that I want to run.
Pretty easy to coach a team with Gretzky and Messier on it, though, right?
But what was really interesting, John, was that the Oiler practices were very similar to the Bears practices. And what was really interesting to me was the system that Glenn put in place was not an NHL system. It was a system from college, and the Bears played it. And I was really impressed with the way that Glenn adopted that system of play and put it in the Oilers, because the Oilers were really the only NHL team that played that way.
Ken, in doing research for this interview, I know that you've done a lot of presentations, you've been a consultant, and a lot of what you talked about, or what you talk about, is leadership. So one of the things I wanted to ask you was, because this is sort of, to me, like the way a coach can be successful on any level, and that's, how do you convince individuals to buy into a collective, whether they have to either change their game or change their mentality? But what have you found during the course of your years? How can that be done to lead to a successful unit?
It's one way, Richard. And no matter what you want your players to do, I've always used this term. I instruct 23 players, but I coach 5. And your relationship with your leadership, your camaraderie and friendship with your leadership has to be tied into everything. You can't expect to be able to make 23 players accountable. You need help, and the help comes from your leaders. So the accountability starts with your leaders, and then you work hard with them so they work the room hard. If you're constantly interfering and you're having to work the room, you're having to work the group, your message gets lost, the energy of the team gets lost. But if you're working with that group of 4 or 5, whoever you decide, and then you send them back in the room to make sure that accountability is taken care of, you get a very dynamic, strong team.
John, one follow-up for me, and that is, Ken, given the fact that you coached over different eras, did you find later in your coaching that you had to communicate with players differently just because of their age or their generation, let's say, versus how you might communicate with players in the 70s or 80s?
Yes. And the big change for me, Richard, was the players needed to know where they were going before the buy-in started. And as it got later and later, they wanted to know what was in it for them. If they made these sacrifices, what would it look like? And you couldn't get offended by having to explain that. Whereas before it was do it this way, this is what we're doing, no questions asked, away you go. There was a lot of debate and dialogue, and you have to form a partnership with the players now. And that partnership has to have give and take on both sides. And if you're not willing to give and you're not willing to take as far as a coach in the proper manner, your players will never buy in. They'll never join sides with you, and you'll have a very difficult time motivating your team.
At what point in your pro career did you say, I have a playbook that works and I'm fully confident about it, and you weren't scared of going in the room?
It started at the beginning of the 1996-97 season. I came in halfway through in 96, and I got schooled, John. I brought the system.
This is when you got hired in Dallas, correct?
Yeah. I brought the system that I'd coached in junior and in minor pro and had a ton of success with, and I brought it into Dallas, and we got schooled. We didn't have the foot speed to play that way. We didn't have the size. And I was really shook up at the end of the year. And then Rick Wilson and Doug Jarvis said, Hitch, there's a different way to play. And we spent the summer together, and they convinced me that the way that Montreal played at that time was the way to play. And they were both ex-Montreal Canadian players, and they sold me on it, and I stayed with it the rest of my life.
So the interesting thing is that, you're talking about your assistants there were 2 former NHL players. You did not play in the NHL ever. You were a good, teenager as a hockey player. But did you ever feel it was a disadvantage not to have played in the NHL?
No, but what I did feel was I don't have the playing background, so I better have the knowledge. I better be smarter than every coach. I better be more detail-oriented. I need to make sure that those things are in place so I could garner the respect of the players. I felt, especially early in my career, I had to show them how much I cared about them and how much I cared about the details and accountability, and prove myself. I felt like I had to prove myself all the time, and so I worked my ass off with trying to find that edge every summer. All the different professional teams I would follow in the summer and stuff like that. I went to Europe to watch soccer. I went to Europe to watch handball. I went to Europe to watch hockey, so I could learn everything I could, so that I felt I had more knowledge than any coach I coached against.